The Tulsa Race Massacre, one of the most devastating incidents of racial violence in U.S. history, occurred between May 31st and June 1st, 1921, in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Often referred to as Black Wall Street, Greenwood was a prosperous African American community symbolizing Black economic success and self sufficiency in the early 20th century. So today's video will provide a comprehensive analysis of the massacre, detailing the events leading up to it, its execution, and the key figures that were involved in it, the immediate aftermath, and its long-term effects on Tulsa and the broader United States. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let us get started. So the early 20th century, and so pretty much it was a time of profound racial, social, and economic upheaval in the United States, particularly in the South and the Midwest. So the period following Reconstruction, it saw an intensification of racial tensions as Black Americans sought greater economic and social autonomy in the face of escalating white resistance. And these tensions were particularly pronounced in Oklahoma, which, though it became a state in 1907, it carried a unique racial history shaped by Native American displacement, Black migration, and the entrenchment of Jim Crow laws. And one of the most remarkable examples of Black self sufficiency and economic empowerment during this period was the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, often referred to as Black Wall Street. So Greenwood was a thriving economic and cultural hub, home to a significant Black population that had migrated from the South in search of economic opportunity and personal safety. And many of these individuals, they were either formerly enslaved people or descendants of enslaved individuals who had sought a better life beyond the oppressive conditions of the Deep South. Greenwood's success was largely driven by a strong network of Black entrepreneurship and mutual support. And the district, it boasted over 600 Black owned businesses, including grocery stores, hotels, theaters, newspapers, restaurants, law offices, and medical practices. Additionally, it had a robust financial sector, including banks that provided loans to Black business owners who would otherwise be denied credit by white institutions. And the presence of well established educational institutions and a hospital, it further underscored the community's commitment to self sufficiency and upward mobility. And the economic prosperity of Greenwood, it stood in stark contrast to the broader racial and economic disparities enforced by Jim Crow segregation. And the white residents of Tulsa, many of who struggled economically, they resented the financial success and independence of their Black neighbors. And this resentment, it was exasperated by a deeply ingrained ideology of white supremacy, which held that Black advancement was a threat to the racial hierarchy that had long governed the United States. And by the early 20th century, the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations, they were experiencing a resurgence, which was fueled by racist propaganda and the false notion that Black prosperity came at the direct expense of white opportunity. And these groups, along with many white political and business leaders, they actively sought to undermine Black economic and social progress through policies that restricted Black voting rights, denied access to quality education, and enforced segregation in every aspect of life. So Oklahoma's history of racial violence and exclusionary policies, it played a significant role in shaping the conditions that led to the Tulsa Race Massacre. And despite the promise of opportunity that attracted Black migrants to the state, Oklahoma quickly instituted a series of racist laws upon achieving statehood. And the Oklahoma Constitution of 1907, it introduced some of the most severe Jim Crow laws in the nation, mandating racial segregation in public facilities, in schools, and in transportation. And these laws were designed to systematically exclude Black citizens from political and economic participation. The climate of racial hostility in Oklahoma was also reflected in the prevalence of lynchings and mob violence. So between 1907 and 1920, numerous lynchings of black individuals occurred throughout the state, often with the complicity or the outright participation of local law enforcement. The normalization of extrajudicial racial violence created an environment in which white mobs had felt emboldened to act with impunity. And another significant factor in the growing hostility toward Greenwood was economic competition, because many working class white residents of Tulsa, they saw black success as a direct threat to their own economic standing. While some white business owners and landlords, they benefited from black consumerism, many white workers resented the idea that black entrepreneurs could amass wealth and create job opportunities for their own community rather than being dependent on white employment. So this economic anxiety, it was further exacerbated by post World War One conditions, and many returning white veterans, they had found themselves struggling to find employment. While Greenwood, it remained relatively insulated from these economic difficulties due to its self-sufficient economy. So white resentment the prosper toward the prosperous black communities, it wasn't unique to Tulsa. It was really a nationwide phenomenon, and it was similar instances of racial violence occurred in cities such as East St. Louis in 1917 and Chicago in 1919, where black economic success was met with white hostility and violence. And in addition to the economic and political factors, the Tulsa Race Massacre was fueled by deep-seated racial stereotypes and misinformation. White newspapers in Tulsa frequently they betrayed the black residents. They betrayed them as criminal, immoral, or inherently dangerous, reinforcing the racist fears among the white population. And these narratives, they were used to justify discrimination and violence, as well as to delegitimize the prosperity of black communities. This backdrop of systemic racism, economic resentment, and widespread acceptance of racial violence, it set the stage for the events for the events of the May 31st through June 1st, 1921. The false accusation of sexual assault against a black teenager known as Dick Rowland provided the immediate spark for the massacre. But the deeper roots of the tragedy, they lay in the long-standing efforts really into suppressing the black economic and social advancement. So the destruction of Greenwood, it was not an isolated event. It was a manifestation of the broader racial dynamics that defined the United States in the early 20th century. So on May 30th, 1921, Dick Rowland, who is a 19-year-old black teenager who worked as a shoe shiner in Tulsa. So basically, this alone was really the catalyst for really starting up the Tulsa Race Massacre. So it was the elevator incident, as they called it. So Dick Rowland, he entered the Drexel building to use a segregated restroom located on the top floor. And to access his restroom, he had to take an elevator, which was operated by Sarah Page, who was a 17-year-old white girl. Now, before we get more further in this, I also want to kind of go over here and give a little backstory, a little summary about who Dick Rowland is first. So Dick Rowland, so his birth name was Jimmy Jones, and it's not really known where he was born, but by 1908, he and his two sisters, they were orphans living in Veneta, Oklahoma, and he was informally adopted by Damie Ford, who was an African American woman. In approximately 1909, Ford and Jones, they moved to Tulsa to join Ford's family, known as the Rowlands. And eventually, the Jones, they took Rowland as his last name, which was later reported as Roland. So he selected his favorite first name, which was Dick, as his own name. So he attended the city's segregated schools, including Booker T. Washington High School, and he dropped out of high school to take a job shining shoes in a white-owned, white-patronized shine parlor on Main Street in downtown Tulsa, as Tulsa was a segregated city where Jim Crow practices were in effect, and black people were not allowed to use toilet facilities used by white people. And there was no separate facility for blacks at the Shine Parlor where he had worked at. And the owner had actually arranged for black employees to use a segregated colored restroom on the top floor of the nearby Drexel building on South Main Street. So the exact details of what really transpired inside the elevator. So they remain disputed because really there was one widely accepted version of the incident. Because what it said was is that it was said that Roland may have tripped and instinctively he grabbed Page's arm to steady himself. And Page reacted by screaming. Alarmed by the scream, Roland had fled from the scene. And there really is no evidence neither. There's no evidence that he physically assaulted her. But the racial climate of this time period, it meant that such an interaction could quickly be misinterpreted and escalated into something much more dangerous. So the following day, May 31st, the Tulsa Tribune, which was a white-owned newspaper, they published an inflammatory report about the incident. And while the original article had been lost, reportedly removed from archives, the remnants of its contents suggest that it accused Roland. It accused him of attempted sexual assault. And some accounts claim that the newspaper's editorial page also called for his lynching, further inciting the white anger. And the racial implications of such an accusation in the Jim Crow South, they were dire, because at the time, the mere suggestion of a black man assaulting a white woman could and often did, it did lead to immediate and extrajudicial punishment. And in the years leading up to 1921, numerous black men have been lynched based on the accusations of sexual misconduct, often, of course, without evidence or due process. And once it was published, tensions escalated rapidly. White citizens of Tulsa, already conditioned to view black men as threats to white womanhood, a common racial stereotype used to justify segregation and violence, they became outraged. And rumors swirled around throughout the city, pretty much inflating the incident into a violent crime that required swift retribution. Meanwhile, the black residents of Greenwood, aware of the ever-present danger of racial violence, they were deeply concerned for Roland's safety. So later that day, the police arrested Roland and detained him at the courthouse, fearing a possible lynching. So black leaders in Tulsa, they sought to ensure his safety because they understood that in the racial climate of the time, that his fate was uncertain. So white mobs had lynched countless black men across the country pretty much based on unsubstantiated allegations. And the Tribune's sensationalist reporting only intensified the threat. So by the evening of May 31st, a white mob had begun to assemble outside the courthouse, demanding that the authorities that they hand Roland over for immediate punishment. And so pretty much it was an all too common prelude to lynching in the American South. And inside, Tulsa's authorities, including Sheriff Willard McCullough, refused to release Roland and claiming that he would remain under their protection. However, the mob outside they grew, and they grew in both numbers and in hostility. And word of the gathering spread to Greenwood, where the black community recognized the urgent need to protect one of their own. And having witnessed and heard of the previous lynchings in other parts of the country, a group of black men, some armed, decided to go to the courthouse to ensure Roland's safety. Initially, a small group of about 25 men had arrived, offering assistance to law enforcement into protecting Roland. And they were turned away, but as the white mob continued to grow, a larger contingent of about 75 black men, they later returned, determined not to let another lynching occur. So the situation outside the courthouse became more volatile as more armed men, both black and white, had gathered around. And eyewitness accounts, they differ on what really happened. So pretty much a lot of eyewitness accounts had differ on what really had happened next. But many suggest that a white man attempted to disarm a black veteran, leading to a gunshot being fired. And this moment of violence, it became the breaking point. Chaos erupted, shots were exchanged between the groups. The white mob, now incensed and armed, they launched a full-scale attack on the black residents, leading to the violent onslaught that became the Tulsa Race Massacre. So, fueled by rage, the white rioters, many of whom had been deputized by local law enforcement, they began their march toward Greenwood, the affluent black district, once again often referred to as Black Wall Street. And this attack, it wasn't random; it was systematic, because the white mobs, they looted the businesses, they set fire to buildings as they moved through the district, um, and also the reports indicate that some rioters had received weapons from the local armory, further escalating the level of destruction. And eyewitness accounts, they describe an atmosphere of terror. Families fled their homes only to be gunned down in the streets or forced to run through smoke-filled alleys. And white mobs, they showed no mercy, shooting indiscriminately and burning homes to the ground. And black residents, though outnumbered and outgunned, they fought back where they could. But the overwhelming force of the white mob proved to be insurmountable. And perhaps one of the most chilling aspects, so one of the most chilling aspects of this massacre was the role of local law enforcement. Because rather than intervening to stop the violence, the police were either passive observers or they were active participants. And numerous reports confirmed that white men were deputized and they were given license to attack Greenwood with impunity. And some officers even joined in the destruction, setting fires or detaining black residents who attempted to defend their homes. And more disturbingly, there is significant evidence to suggest that the white rioters, they used private planes to attack from above, and survivors recounted seeing aircraft flying overhead, dropping incendiary devices onto buildings and firing down on black residents. And this was a remarkable and horrifying escalation of racial violence, possibly the first aerial attack on American soil at this time. And while the exact details, while they do remain debated, about the use of planes, but really the use of planes, like they added a new dimension to the onslaught, ensuring that Greenwood was not burned from the ground, but was assaulted from the sky. And by the morning of June 1st, Greenwood lay in ashes. Fires raged across the district, with entire blocks reduced to rubble. Businesses, churches, homes, everything that had made Greenwood a beacon of black prosperity, it was all gone. And estimates of the death toll, they vary widely, with numbers ranging from dozens to over 300. And thousands were left homeless and their lives shattered in a matter of hours. And the white rioters, they faced no immediate repercussions. Instead, black survivors were rounded up and they were placed in internment camps under the guise of protecting them. Meanwhile, no white individual was charged for the killings, the destruction, or the looting, and the legal system that had already failed Dick Rowland now failed the entirety of Greenwood. So really, a lot of people, key figures in the groups that were involved in this. So we've already discussed with Dick Rowland, the accused black teenager, and also Sarah Page, who was also the white elevator operator. And I will also, not really a video, but most likely overall to kind of give like a quick post on giving a bit of a background on Sarah Page when I do have time. When I actually do have some time on my hands to do so. But there were other figures such as J.B. Stratford, who is the black businessman and hotel owner, and also O.W. Gurley, who was the architect of Black Wall Street, and also with law enforcement, city officials that were complicit and active participants in white supremacist mobs. So when it comes to J.B. Stratford, so J.B. Stratford, also known as John the Baptist Stratford, So he was one of Greenwood's most successful businessmen and an outspoken advocate for Black economic self sufficiency. So, born in Kentucky in 1861 to formerly enslaved parents, Stratford was a lawyer and entrepreneur who settled in Tulsa and played a key role in building Greenwood's thriving economy. So, Stratford, he owned the luxurious Stratford Hotel, one of the most prominent Black owned hotels in the United States at the time. And the hotel symbolized Black prosperity and resilience, making it a target of resentment among white Tulsans. As racial tensions escalated following Rowland's arrest, Stratford was among the Black leaders who called for the protection of Rowland, fearing a lynching. And when the violence had erupted, Stratford's hotel became one of the many Black businesses that burned to the ground. And falsely accused of inciting a riot, he fled Tulsa and eventually resettled in Chicago, where he continued his legal and business pursuits decades later. And the state of Oklahoma posthumously exonerated him, recognizing the injustice that he had suffered. And you also had O.W. Gurley, who was the architect of Black Wall Street. So Ottawa W. Gurley, a visionary entrepreneur and community leader, he played a foundational role in the development of Greenwood. So, born in 1868, Gurley moved to Tulsa in the early 1900s, and he used his wealth and influence to foster a self sustaining Black economy. So, he purchased land in what would become Greenwood, and he deliberately sold plots to Black entrepreneurs, helping create a community where Black businesses that they thrive independently of white control. And under his leadership, Greenwood became home to banks, theaters, grocery stores, newspapers, and other enterprises that provided wealth and stability to Black residents. And when the white mob, when they attacked Greenwood, his properties were also among those destroyed. And like many Black leaders, he was forced to flee, and his wealth was largely obliterated in the massacre. So the systematic destruction of Greenwood ensured that Black economic independence in Tulsa was permanently weakened, and a blow pretty much from which it never fully recovered. And you also talk about including like with the law enforcement and city officials. So the role that the law enforcement and the officials had played. So, once again, like it wasn't really one of maintaining order, but really it was just either one of complicity or directly participating in the violence. Because rather than protecting the residents of Greenwood, they pretty much allowed or they encouraged the white mobs to attack the Black citizens and destroy their homes and their businesses. And once again, some officers deputized the white men, effectively granting them the legal authority to engage in violence against the Black residents. And reports also suggest that the city officials they provided arms to the white rioters, and that Oklahoma National Guard. So pretty much that of the Oklahoma National Guard too, because rather than stopping the massacre, they arrested the Black survivors and they placed them in internment camps. And meanwhile, the white rioters they looted, they set fire to all the homes, the businesses, and the churches with little interference from the authorities. And the city government, they later failed to prosecute a single individual for the massacre, reinforcing a system of impunity that allowed racial violence to go unchecked. And the official response in the aftermath largely blamed the Black residents for the violence, further entrenching the racial injustice in Tulsa. And perhaps the most direct and devastating force in the massacre was the white supremacist mobs that carried out the destruction, because consisting of thousands of white residents, these mobs engaged in coordinated acts of terror against the Black Tulsans, killing an estimated 300 people and leaving thousands of people homeless, armed with rifles, shotguns, even aircraft that dropped incendiary devices on Greenwood. So these white mobs, they systematically burned down Black businesses, the churches and the homes, and survivors recalled scenes of unimaginable horror because you had Black bodies thrown into mass graves, families that are forced to flee while being shot at, and entire livelihoods erased in just a matter of hours. So the mobs were fueled by a deep seated racial resentment, economic envy, and a culture of white supremacy that had long sought to suppress black advancement. And their actions were not spontaneous, but they were premeditated and reflecting a broader history of racial terror that sought to enforce white dominance through violence and intimidation. So the violence that unfolded between May 31st and June 1st, 1921, resulted in the death, once again, of at least 300 black residents, though the actual toll, it may have been higher than that. So, and I do believe that the toll itself, is actually more higher really than 300 black residents, and thousands were injured, and the destruction of Greenwood, and once again often referred to as Black Wall Street, devastated the local black community. So more than 1,200 homes and businesses were burned to the ground, leaving around 10,000 black residents homeless. Churches, schools, hospitals, even the local newspaper office, were reduced to rubble, effectively erasing the infrastructure that allowed Greenwood to thrive as an independent and prosperous black economic hub. And the National Guard, the National Guard's intervention in the massacre, it came too late to prevent the widespread destruction, because rather than focusing on stopping the white mob responsible for the violence, authorities detained hundreds of black residents under the guise of maintaining order. And many were taken to internment centers. Once again, internment centers, and in these centers, they were held for days without due process. And instead of protecting the victims, they instead criminalized them, reinforcing the prevailing racial hierarchy and denying them any form of immediate restitution or justice. And following the massacre, black survivors, they sought compensation through legal channels, including insurance claims for their destroyed homes and their businesses. However, though, the insurance companies, they refused to pay out these claims, citing riot exclusion clauses. And the local government, they also took no steps to offer restitution, which leaving the survivors to fend for themselves. And instead of having to acknowledge the devastation, Tulsa's white leaders actively engaged in having to cover it all up. And official records of deaths and injuries, they were manipulated. And the newspapers, they largely avoided discussing the event. And for decades, you had history books omitted, or they were downplayed, or pretty much they downplayed the massacre's significance. So the systematic erasure of the massacre from public discourse, it meant that many Americans remained unaware of the tragedy for most of the 20th century. And survivors and their descendants, they carried the trauma and the economic burden in silence, while the perpetrators, they faced no legal consequences. And the efforts to suppress knowledge of the massacre ensured that the racial injustices it represented persisted in both the local and the national context. So the loss of wealth and infrastructure in Greenwood, it had long-lasting economic consequences, because the destruction of homes and businesses wiped out generations of accumulated black wealth, setting back the economic progress for Tulsa's black residents. And many survivors, they were forced to live in tents or makeshift housing for years, struggling to rebuild without financial assistance. And despite these obstacles, some survivors attempted to reconstruct Greenwood, displaying remarkable resilience by the late 1920s. And parts of Greenwood have been rebuilt, and black entrepreneurs, once again, they opened businesses. However, the economic and the social landscape had changed permanently, and racial discrimination remained deeply entrenched in Tulsa, and the once flourishing district never fully regained its former prosperity. So, the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, it left behind not only physical devastation, but also long lasting legal and economic repercussions that deeply affected the survivors and their descendants. In the immediate aftermath, the residents who lost their homes, their businesses, and their wealth, and once again, they all saw justice through the legal system. They were filing lawsuits in an effort to obtain financial compensation for the damages that they suffered. But the efforts were systematically thwarted because, once again, the courts, they dismissed their claims, citing procedural technicalities, and no insurance companies honored their policies due to racially motivated exclusion clauses. So, in effect, the legal system that should have provided restitution instead reinforced racial injustice, denying the survivors the ability to rebuild their lives. And the economic impact of this failure cannot be overstated because Greenwood, known for its thriving black-owned businesses and relative prosperity, it never fully recovered. Survivors and their descendants, they faced generational poverty as the massacre erased accumulated black wealth and deprived future generations of economic opportunities. And this loss of intergenerational wealth, it stands in stark contrast to the prosperity that many white families in Tulsa have maintained, exasperating racial economic disparities that persist to this day. And the systemic barriers to rebuilding contributed to the broader racial wealth gap in the United States, demonstrating how targeted racial racial violence, how it continues to impact black communities long after the initial act of destruction. And for decades, the massacre was it was excluded from the mainstream historical narratives because schools they didn't teach it, official records were altered or destroyed, and many survivors they were silenced through fear and intimidation. And this oppression, it wasn't accidental. So yeah, so I mean, this wasn't accidental at all, one bit, because but really, it was part of a broader pattern in American history where atrocities against the black communities they were either minimized or they were erased to protect the white perpetrators and to maintain the myth of racial progress. And local officials and media in Tulsa they played a role in this as well too, a very significant role in the erasure because there were newspaper archives at this time that once reported on the destruction were either removed or they were altered, shifting the blame onto the black residents rather than having to acknowledge the coordinator attack by the white mobs. And survivors who spoke out were often met with threats, which once again, further discouraging the dissemination of truthful accounts. And really the result, it was a collective amnesia in which even many Oklahomans remain unaware of one of the most egregious instances of racial violence in American history. And the broader consequences of this suppression were significant. And by obscuring the massacre, the nation was deprived of a crucial opportunity to confront racial injustice and enact meaningful policy changes that could have addressed the lingering economic and the social disparities. This erasure also reinforced a culture in which black suffering it was dismissed, and the perpetrators of racial violence were rarely held accountable. And the suppression of history it served as an additional layer of injustice, ensuring that the massacre's victims would not even receive posthumous acknowledgement for their suffering. The long overdue recognition of the massacre has gained momentum in recent years, particularly around its 100th anniversary in 2021. And the centennial, it brought national and international attention to the tragedy, leading to renewed discussions on historical accountability, reparations, and policy interventions aimed at addressing its lasting effects. And one of the most significant developments is what was the push for reparations for massacre survivors and their descendants. And advocates have argued that financial compensation is not merely symbolic, but necessary to rectify the generational economic harm that was inflicted by the destruction of Greenwood. However, despite the growing support and the legal and political barriers, so really the legal and political barriers, they continue to prevent the substantial reparations from being implemented. And efforts at the local and state levels have included initiatives such as economic development programs and scholarships for descendants. But these fall short of the full restitution that activists and survivors demand. Additionally, the centennial spurred it spurred major uh, uh, a memorialization efforts, and the opening of the Greenwood Rising History Center. It provided an educational space dedicated to to preserving the history of the massacre and its impact. Legislative actions such as the recognition of the massacre by Congress and the establishment of commissions to study its effects. It marks steps toward greater national acknowledgement. So President Joe Biden, he actually, his visit to Tulsa in 2021, it further signified a shift in how the massacre was addressed at the highest levels of government. So despite these efforts, challenges still remain. And the fight for reparations, it continues with legal battles still being waged in an attempt to secure compensation. And many people argue that acknowledgement without material restitution is insufficient, and that true justice requires direct economic redress for the descendants of those who suffered. Additionally, while more Americans are now aware of the massacre, its implications, particularly regarding the systemic racial inequality, the systemic racial inequities, it still remains a contentious topic in broader discussions about racial injustice. So the massacre's legacy is one of both profound loss and ongoing resilience. While the attack devastated Black Wall Street and it robbed generations of Black Tulsans of economic advancement, the continued efforts to seek justice and recognition, they serve as a testament to the enduring fight against racial injustice in the United States. And the massacre's long term effects are a stark reminder that historical violence does not simply fade into the past, and its consequences reverberate through time, demanding acknowledgement, redress, and continued advocacy for equity. So, overall, what are a lot of lessons that we overall can learn from the Tulsa Race Massacre? So, a lot of lessons that we ourselves can learn is, on one hand, we can learn in this case about the fragility of Black prosperity in early 20th century America. So, the success of Greenwood, it was not enough to protect it from racial violence and systemic destruction, and also the role of misinformation in inciting violence, because sensationalized and inflammatory media coverage, it contributed to the escalation of racial tensions. And you also have state and law enforcement complicity, because the massacre was enabled by the inaction and, in some cases, active participation of police and city officials, historical suppression, and the erasure of Black trauma. For decades, the massacre was omitted from historical narratives, which highlighted the systemic efforts to downplay the racial violence. And also, you have the long term impact of racial violence on economic mobility. So, the destruction of Black Wall Street, it had lasting economic consequences for survivors and their descendants, contributing to the racial wealth gap and also patterns of racial terror and the need for justice. The Tulsa Race Massacre is one of many instances where Black communities were destroyed by the white mobs, yet justice and reparations were systematically denied. And also, the last lesson is the power and remembrance. So the power of remembrance and historical accountability. Because recent efforts to acknowledge and memorialize the massacre demonstrate the importance of confronting the historical injustices. So also, and once again, if you do have time on your hands, if you ever have time, but please, definitely take time, to answer some questions overall that I'm going to show here for you guys. You know, overall, just to make sure that you give your thoughts and your opinions and your point of view, because they are always appreciated here on this channel. So when it comes to the different questions, there are ones in where with the context and the causes. So like in this case, what were the main economic and social conditions that allowed Greenwood to thrive before the massacre? And also, how did racial resentment and white supremacy contribute to the tensions in Tulsa leading up to the massacre? And also, what role did they play exactly, in escalating the violence? And also, the event itself. So, like, how did the confrontation at the courthouse, how did it escalate into a full-scale massacre? And what evidence exists regarding the use of aerial bombings during the attack? And how did local law enforcement and government officials respond to the violence? And other ones, of course, under like when it comes to the immediate aftermath. So, in the immediate aftermath, how did survivors attempt to rebuild after the massacre, and what obstacles did they face? And also, why were insurance claims and legal attempts for reparations, why were they denied? And how did it impact, Tulsa's black population in the decades that followed? And when it comes to the long-term impact and the legacy of the massacre, why was the massacre omitted from mainstream historical narratives for so long? And what efforts have been made in recent years to acknowledge the massacre and pursuing reparations? And also, how does the Tulsa Race Massacre, how does it connect to the broader patterns of racial violence and systemic oppression in the United States and US history? And most importantly, what lessons can modern social justice movements, what can they learn from the history of Greenwood and from its destruction? But all in all, the eruption of violence on May 31st, 1921, it wasn't a spontaneous riot. It was a massacre, an act of racial terrorism that was meant to erase a thriving black community. And the Tulsa Race Massacre will be buried in historical obscurity for decades, deliberately omitted from textbooks and public discourse. And the coordinated destruction of Greenwood remains one of the most darkest chapters in American history, uh, highlighting not only the dangers of racial hatred, but also the complicit role of law enforcement and the justice system in facilitating such violence. And the massacre, it serves as a harrowing reminder of what happens when white supremacy goes unchecked. And it wasn't merely the actions of a mob, but the culmination of systemic racism, economic envy, and a legal system that allowed mass murder and destruction to go unpunished. So today, its legacy demands reckoning, acknowledgement, and justice, not just for those who perished, but the generations that have continued to bear the scars of its aftermath. But with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, that of course comes to the end and the conclusion of this video here today. So, as always, ladies and gentlemen, always remember that no matter the challenge, always be smooth, always be steady, and always be aggressive. Stay focused, stay determined, and keep pushing forward. Until next time, keep rising to the occasion. Peace.